Hi, everyone, and welcome to our first chat of 2020. My name is Tara, and I'm a team member here at Understood. Today, we're going to be talking about how to help your child with self advocacy, and we are so excited to have Brian Thomas joining us as today's expert. Hi, Brian, how are you?
Hi, Tara. How are you? Good
I'm
to see
well.
you.
Thank you. Good to see you as well. Brian, would you
Happy
like to
New
take
Year.
a moment to just briefly introduce yourself to the folks joining us?
Sure. My name is Brian Thomas. I am the assistant head of school at a school called Mary Institute and St. Louis Country Day School in St. Louis. This is my 30th year of being either a teacher or administrator, and I'm really happy to be here. So, Happy New Year to everybody out there.
Thank you so much. I do want to just remind those joining us that we will be taking questions. So if you have a question, please feel free to type it in the chat box. And please, it is helpful if you provide your child's age so that you can receive a more targeted response. So let's get started. My first question for you, Brian, is what is self advocacy?
Self advocacy is something that really teaches both self confidence and a way for students to be themselves.
Okay.
Really, that's what it boils down to. There's a great article on the Understood website called "The Importance of Self Advocacy for Kids Who Learn and Think Differently." So some of my comments will pertain to that, some won't.
Okay.
But the long and short of it is, advocate is a Latin root that really means towards voice. So when you think about that, it's being able to activate your voice in a way, going towards your voice in a way that is powerful and meaningful. One of the things when I think about it, it's like learning how to ride a bike.
Okay.
Like when you have training wheels, your parents put those training wheels on a bike. They don't really put you behind the wheel of a car, right? So when I learned how to ride a bike, as I was thinking about, I'm not really thinking about my kid's going to be getting behind the wheel of a car, but
Right.
those essential skills of understanding to look both ways, understanding to go closer to the things that you desire when you're riding your bike. That's basically what you're doing when you're self advocating. And self advocacy is also about understanding, really knowing yourself, understanding yourself, knowing the kinds of things that you need for yourself,
Okay.
and then communicating those things very clearly, so that you can be very confident in what you do. So activating your voice is what self advocacy is about.
Got it. And this kind of leads me to my next question, which is why is self advocacy such an important skill to build?
Self advocacy is important in that you're not always going to be there for your child. It's probably the one skill that, sort of like education, it's the one skill that somebody cannot take away from your child at all. It allows kids not to feel isolated when they're in a classroom,
Okay.
and it really also makes sure that things that they can't do right now, that in the future that they will be able to do. It's really important that your child understands that, as early as they can understand that, even though it may be frustrating for them right now, they'll be able to do it and do it better once they figure that out.
Okay.
You can guide your child through some of that understanding as they go along.
And Brian, what does self advocacy look like in action?
I think it means that, again, just like I said, that you don't have to be with your child when they need something in the classroom or out in the world. It means that your student, instead of fearing that your teacher is going to call on them, say if they're having reading challenges or math challenges, fearing that they're going to be called on,
Okay.
that they can sort of interrupt that fear so that they can get the most out of what they need. Being able to tell a teacher, like, when you call on me when I'm reading, it really interrupts me being kind of in the moment, so that I can actually learn. And self advocacy in action means that your child is getting for him or herself exactly what they need, and they're able to voice that in the moment.
And does this skill look different at different ages, would you say?
It does look different at different ages. I think kids as young as second grade can learn it, but it looks different in high school and middle school. So in earlier, you may need to be with your child in order for them to understand what it looks like in the classroom. So sitting down instead of not having your kid beside you, being able to say, I'm going to talk a little bit for Brian right now or for Tara, but sometimes when you call on them during class when everybody else is reading and they're not able to do that, it stops the flow of their being able to actually think about some of the things. In middle school, it may be around, I don't know, organization, and in middle school, you may want to coach your child to stand up for themselves, say with a particular teacher. So it's coaching at home that may help them do something. So pulling them aside, role playing with them, and giving them the tools in order to do something. And in high school, it may very well mean that you're checking in regularly with your child in the areas of difficulties, understand so that they understand really very well both their challenges but also their strengths, so that they can go out and really get the things in school that they need. Being really aware of their strengths and weaknesses is the hallmark of self-advocacy.
Got it. Let's dive a bit deeper. Brian, can you talk about why it's especially important for kids with learning and thinking differences to learn how to advocate for themselves?
Well, the thing that I think parents need to interrupt is the idea that learning happens all at the same time, and having your child really get that learning for them, that learning how to read, for instance, happens anywhere between the ages of 3 or 4 all the way through grades 4 or 5.
Okay.
And learning to read with automaticness or automaticity or fluency without sort of bumps means that sometimes it's just really important for them to understand that it's a continuum, that everybody does not have to be at the same place at the same time. That's the same thing in middle school around math or science, or even high school around things that kids get really worried about. Usually it's locked into grades, so if you could sort of degrade or uncouple the idea of grades as being a part of a kid's self-worth,
Okay.
I think that's the most important thing.
Got it. Thank you. What are some ways families can help elementary age kids learn to advocate for themselves?
In elementary school, I
Yes.
think being able to, again, as I said, sit down, not leaving your kid out of the discussion, but bringing them into the discussion when you have it with the teachers, teaching them how their brain works. Sometimes if they have an IEP or psycho ed evaluation, a sheet of paper that says this is how your kid learns, teaching your students from anywhere from elementary school all the way through high school the workings of their brain and how their brain works is the most important thing. Kids as young as maybe 7 or 8 can learn that, but sometimes it's hard for people to say, look, your brain also doesn't come with an owner's manual, but you can give it an owner's manual.
Got it. We are starting to get some parent questions and comments in. So
Great.
our first question comes from Adriana. The problem I face is that parents themselves have difficulties advocating for their child. When parents don't speak up for their child, then it is really hard for the child to speak up for themselves. So do you have any comments or thoughts that you would like to share with Adriana?
Yeah, Adriana, that's a really good question, and what I would suggest to parents is that they also need to learn how their kid learns. Really stop and become almost like a scientist. We don't get an owner's manual with our children's brains, but you understand what their strengths are, and we tend to focus a lot on weaknesses, so you don't have to focus so much on that as you do, like, well, boy, they've memorized this book, even though they may not be reading it, right? Or they can do math in their head, even though they haven't written it down. So understand that those weaknesses or deficiencies that people call them also come with strengths. They say you need about five uh, uh, real sort of positive things to counteract anything negative. So if you can think of that rule of five each and every time when you're trying to understand your own child's weaknesses or deficiency, learn how your child learns, and then teach them what you know about them. Like, I noticed that about you, that you memorized that entire book. That's a great thing. Now let's figure out what each word means.
Thank you, Brian. Our next question, what are some ways that families can help kids practice these skills at home?
I think the best way, just like riding a bike, really the best way is to understand that you can role play, as we talked about with kids. So I'm going to be a teacher right now, and it may sound harsh to your kid when they're in front of their friends, but if a teacher says, hey, Brian, could you read page 43 at the top of the page? What would you do? What would you say to that? And if your kid says, I can't tell my teacher in the middle of a classroom in front of my friends that I can't read that passage, but if your kid can say before knowing that reading is coming up and that is one of those places, like not to skip me, but to give me some idea, some sort of heads up,
Okay.
so that I can begin to advocate a little bit more for myself. That's one way that I would do it. Just role playing with your kid.
Okay.
It's the most effective way, I think.
Okay. We have a follow-up question from Adriana. The question is, are there groups that parents can join to learn how to advocate for their child?
The most important one, I think, there are now groups. The Parent Education Network, PEN, is one. There's certainly a lot of resources on understood.org of groups around the country, but PEN is the one that I know the best because I was a parent on there, and I saw other kids who had similar issues to my daughter advocating for themselves. So Project Eye to Eye was another one. David Flink, John Mooney's organization. Anytime that your kid can have representation in her or his head about self-advocacy, watching some older kid, maybe 2 or 3 years older, not necessarily high school age or college age, whatever that is, doing what you want your kid to do, and just say, watch what she does. Watch what he does as they go through it. But understood.org, reaching out to an expert, reaching out to me, may be a really good way to hook your kid up with an organization that does that thing that you want your child to do.
Thank you for that, Brian. Our next
You're
question, for kids who have learning and thinking differences, like, for example, ADHD, how much should families talk to them about their specific challenges?
I had a parent in my school who refused to talk to her kid about his ADHD, and as a result, he struggled. She jumped in each and every time, and I remember calling a meeting with all of my teachers and this parent to say, you're really handcuffing your child for being able to advocate for himself. And she said, look, I'm just trying to protect him. I don't want him to know that he is struggling. And I said to her, do you think he doesn't know? And I think that really stopped her in her tracks. He did know. So the earlier you can do it, I've seen kids as young as second grade, but between second and sixth grade especially, is really important to not say, that's who you are, but to allow kids to say, this is how you learn best. That's the most important way. So teaching them about how they learn early enough, and not how they don't learn and how they fail, because they know that. What you're trying to get to them is when they're at their best. When are you at your best?
Okay. Our next question comes from a parent that says, what are your thoughts on allowing kids to fail? Fail is an acronym for first attempt in learning. The added comment is, we seem to save our kids from life.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think of my friend who's a track coach, and he gets all of these kids who are first time in whatever event they are, and he just says, "Hey, look, this is the end of the season, and let's go through and map out personal best and understand that that a season for learning, which is usually between September and June, you will be at your best and sometimes not at your best. Sometimes you will hit and peak and hit walls, but then you will plateau and go even further. So it's important to treat that almost like a coach would, to say that that your child really, if they're given the opportunity, that they can overcome just about any challenge, just by giving them the right amount of coaching.
Our next question is, when might it be a good idea to include self-advocacy goals on a student's IEP if they receive special education services?
There's another great article on the understood.org website about self-advocacy and IEP goals. I would say, again, the earlier the better. Whenever kids are really ready to not just speak up for themselves, but you're seeing that they can articulate to you or articulate to some of their teachers about when things are working for them and when they aren't working for them. So as early as possible, I think the best schools that deal with kids, especially in special ed or even in specialized schools, the more that you can have kids advocating for themselves and institutionalizing it, and having teachers say, okay, this is a part of my goal is to get this student to speak up for herself or himself, the better.
Our next question that we have here, what are some ways I can motivate my child to begin to improve their self-advocacy skills?
The most important way is just to talk to them, right? One of the things, there was a great episode during Oprah's broadcast where a parent took her child out to a mall, kind of one of those enclosed malls, and just said, I want you to ask a stranger a question about a direction, to just demystify stranger danger in some ways. I think it's the same thing with self-advocacy too, is being able to coach your child through an encounter with a teacher or an administrator. Certainly sometimes you should do that first if they're young, but not having them always out of the room when you're talking about them, so that they can begin to talk about themselves in front of other people. So to coach them up.
Before I get to our next question, we do have a comment. The comment is, I wish all teachers and heads of schools were like Brian. I just wanted to share that before we get to our next question.
Wow, thank you.
Our next question is, it's especially important for young adults to be able to advocate for themselves as they transition into work or college. As a parent yourself and an educator, what advice do you have for families and young adults as they transition out of high school?
You know that self-advocacy is not something that goes away, and in fact, sometimes it is something that that older people, adults especially, need to be reminded of often. Whether you're working as an employee, because usually, the school thing transitions into either working for somebody else or being in relationship with somebody else. And if you know sort of what the right thing is to do, then it's really incumbent upon you to get to being able to say that, right? So my daughter, for instance, was hospitalized a couple of weeks ago, and she is really, really nervous that her insurance is going to be denied. So she asked me to coach her through a conversation that she might have with the hospital. I coached her through. She was able to have that conversation without me in the room, even though this is a kid who could barely speak, would barely speak in fourth or fifth grade. For those of you who know my daughter, I talk about her, write about her quite a bit. But understanding that a really quiet kid, especially a kid who's not used to speaking up for themselves, knowing what they want, it's really important just to have somebody that they can lean on, an adult, another friend, who can coach them through or listen to what their worries are about getting the things that they need.
Our next question, what are some skill sets or specific traits of an effective advocate?
I think you are building habits of mind and confidence. This is where I started before, and the idea that you drive a car starts really with the idea of learning how to ride a bike. I mean, you can certainly drive a car without learning how to ride a bike, but I think you're so much better by being aware of your surroundings. So confidence, being able to be what I would say self-efficacious, which means just I can get the things for myself that I need for myself. You're undercutting or taking away the victimhood out of all of this. So some people don't believe in labels. They don't like the labels of dyslexia or ADHD or learning disabilities or learning differences. They just say that's how I learn, and it's helpful to kind of dispense with labels when you are trying to learn, and not to rely on that as a crutch, but to say, what are my strengths? Really start with the foundational elements of strengths. Kids with learning differences, once they get through those really difficult years of being in school, learn that element of confidence and risk-taking, positive risk-taking, healthy risk-taking, more than any other students that I've seen. Many CEOs, many entrepreneurs are people with learning and attention issues because they're not afraid of looking wrong to other people. They acknowledge their weaknesses. They minimize them. They don't often go away, but they really maximize their strengths.
We have some parent questions coming in. So our next question comes from Linda. Linda says, Pierre is 10 years old. His teachers applaud him all the time about how bright he is, but his behavior is affected. How, as a single mom, do I help him understand that his behavior is unacceptable?
Well, I would start with, really, Linda, I would start with asking Pierre, what does he want in those situations sometimes? If there's a need that Pierre is trying to express that's not being met when he acts out or acts up, then have him begin to think about ways of putting that down and setting it aside for a while. Like if it's like, I really want to go outside and play with my friends because they're at recess and I'm stuck here having to finish up this work. If Pierre can express that and then set it aside so that he can get down to business, I think especially with kids with attentional issues, they sometimes get caught in the loop in their head. But if they can just spend some time either talking it out or writing it out, acknowledging what they're feeling, so that they can set it aside and get down to business. But just talking to him, not in a shameful or embarrassing way, but in a way that allows his strengths to emerge.
We have time for a few more questions. So our next question comes from Ellie. Ellie's question is, what should a parent do when a child is advocating for something that the parent absolutely knows what the child wants is unreasonable, but is convincing the school the child should get his way?
Oh, that's a big one to unpack here. I would say that sometimes helping them to hear it out loud for them to say, how will that be once you are able to leave math class or whatever that thing that you feel is unreasonable is. Have them voicing it and then role playing out for them. Again, I believe in role playing it out for them, how the consequences may roll out after that, right? And just to go to a future state, future vision of things that that may result for the things that they're advocating for, if that makes sense.
Our next question is a loaded one, so bear with me.
Wait.
The question is, we need to teach our kids, 1, to show up on time, 2, to get along with their peers, and 3, to ask for help. You are talking to the third piece. So how soon do we approach the first 2, which is showing up on time and to get along with your peers? So I'll ask that question first, and then I'll get to the second part.
Okay, so I would say the idea of things happen without you, right? So when you don't show up, there's stuff that's happening, and there is the mantra of, if you're 5 minutes early, you're late. If you're on time, you're late. So showing up 5 minutes early really helps you to get your mind around, especially for kids with learning and attention issues. They need to get their mind around the environment so that they can relax and their brains can relax. That's the first thing. The second thing, getting along with others. I think that that being able to listen well to what somebody else is saying, and even wanting what they're not saying, is a profound skill, right? Social media teaches that we need to react and we need to say stuff right away, as opposed to listen deeply to what somebody's really saying underneath of that. So teaching your kids those 2 things, right? Showing up early and listening beyond listening is the most important thing for me.
So then the second part of that question is a little more specific to ADHD. It says, our kids with ADHD are often super social, however, they're struggling with deadlines. What are some ways to help?
I think the most important way is to sometimes trick yourself into thinking earlier. Even though I'm not ADD or ADHD, I still struggle sometimes with deadlines, but I will trick myself into setting false deadlines or having somebody else set false deadlines so that I can improve upon my own thinking. You can't really get good at anything unless you see it a second time around or even a third time around, right? So I think little tricks with your brain by saying, oh, the deadline's at 3 o'clock or even on a Monday, but having it done on a Friday is even better, because it just allows you to be freer in your own and more creative in your own thinking if you trick yourself and trick your mind into thinking earlier.
And we have room for one more question. So before we wrap up, I would like to ask, what are the benefits of self-advocacy?
I think the most important benefit is, as I said before, confidence and charisma. The thing that comes with self-advocacy is the ability to feel wholly comfortable in your own skin. And when you feel confident, people want to be around you. People want and invite, I feel invited into your presence. And it means that you're not thinking so much about the things that you didn't do, because we loop in our head, even as adults, about stuff that we have to do or we haven't done, or the things that we aren't. You are enough as you are, and the ability to self-advocate gives you the confidence and gives you the ability to be charismatic, to really be your entire self, to laugh at yourself, to be humble in the face of even challenging circumstances, and to know that whatever you do, everything's going to be okay.
Thank you, Brian. There's one more parent question that I did happen to see, so I do want to try to get to it. The question comes from a parent that says, Stephen is 15 with ADHD, and he has 2 ASD brothers, older and younger. He advocates for them, but not for himself. How can I help him know he is a priority and to seek help when he needs it?
That's a great question, because I think embedded in advocacy or self-advocacy is advocacy, right? So you can train yourself to be an advocate for yourself. If she can get Stephen to be his brother, to imagine Stephen as one of his brothers that he's able to advocate for, and say, what would you do if this were, Brian or Phil, or and allowing him to imagine a series of responses for himself, that would allow, because it takes practice, that would allow him to be kinder to himself as well. Because it's not being unkind if you're not advocating for yourself, but it is really important to be not selfish, and not selfless, but self-loving in that way, by advocating for himself.
Absolutely. Brian, thank you so much. Unfortunately, that is all the time that we have for today's chat. I do want to thank Brian and thank you all for joining us. I do want to remind everyone that you can find all of our chats archived at u.org/calendar. And if you have a question that we unfortunately did not have time to get to today, feel free to join our community at u.org/community. Thank you.
Excellent.